In 1881, an Irish-born schoolteacher living in New Jersey rolled a primitive, bullet-shaped submarine down a wooden ramp and into the murky waters of the Passaic River. His goal was to build a secret weapon to sink warships of the British Royal Navy. This vessel, dubbed the Fenian Ram by the press, was not backed by a sovereign military. It was entirely financed by secret donations collected from Irish immigrants working as laborers and domestic servants across America. The architects of this plot were the Fenian Brotherhood. They saw that throwing untrained farmers with pitchforks at the world's most powerful military was a recipe for failure, so they turned to experimental science and professional organization. To understand how a scattered diaspora recovering from starvation managed to crowdfund a transnational military machine, we have to look at how they engineered a new kind of revolutionary structure, the modern shadow state. In the late 1840s, the Great Famine decimated Ireland, reducing the population by millions through starvation and mass migration. The surviving generation attempted an armed uprising in 1848, but it collapsed almost immediately. This map shows the problem. Traditional Irish resistance relied on localized, poorly armed agrarian revolts. Against the vast, centralized bureaucracy and military might of the British Empire, this approach lacked the scale to succeed. Rather than surrender, leaders of the failed 1848 rising, including an exiled Gaelic scholar named John O'Mahony, fled to Paris. There, they embedded themselves within the networks of European secret societies. They spent years studying the structure of these underground movements, mapping out what they called the technique of conspiracy. They decided that future efforts would require absolute secrecy and a highly disciplined professional vanguard. Defeating an imperial power required them to leave the agrarian rebellion model behind and engineer a modern, global apparatus from scratch. In 1858, they established a dual-core organization. One half was the Irish Republican Brotherhood, a hidden underground cell operating in Dublin. The other half was the Fenian Brotherhood, an open, public-facing operation headquartered in New York. Operating across the Atlantic allowed the New York node to exploit American constitutional liberties. They could openly host meetings, recruit members, and raise funds entirely out of reach of British authorities. To fund a massive future uprising, they needed capital, so they launched a financial strategy designed to establish their own sovereignty. They began issuing their own Irish Republic bonds. These were professionally engraved certificates printed by the Continental Banknote Company in New York. Sold to immigrants in denominations as low as $5, the bonds successfully raised the modern equivalent of millions of dollars. Each bond carried a specific promise. The debt would be repaid, with interest, 6 months after the international community officially recognized an independent Irish nation. By issuing sovereign debt, the Fenians created the financial infrastructure of a government in exile, backed by a global treasury. While the treasury filled, the outbreak of the American Civil War in 1861 provided the Fenians with an unexpected training ground. Tens of thousands of Irish immigrants enlisted, gaining intense practical experience in modern infantry maneuvers and artillery. By the time the war ended in 1865, the Brotherhood claimed over 300,000 members, nearly half being battle-hardened veterans prepared for immediate deployment. A faction within the movement realized they didn't need to cross the Atlantic to attack the empire. They developed the Canada Plan, striking north from the U.S. border to seize Canadian transportation networks and territory, holding the colony hostage in exchange for Irish sovereignty. This strategy materialized at the 1866 Battle of Ridgeway. When 800 Fenians crossed the Niagara River into Canada, their Civil War experience allowed them to rout the larger, completely untrained Canadian militia. The tactical victories were short-lived. The United States government quickly clamped down on the border to avoid an international incident with Britain. Blocked from conventional land invasions, the Fenians pivoted to scientific warfare, funding urban dynamite campaigns and the experimental submarine project in New Jersey. The Brotherhood had built and deployed an independent army on foreign soil. They proved they possessed the logistical capability to strike British interests from thousands of miles away. Ultimately, the Fenian military operations collapsed. The border raids were neutralized. An attempted 1867 uprising in Ireland was dismantled by British intelligence. and the Fenian ram submarine was abandoned on a riverbank after an internal theft left it in the hands of members who couldn't operate it. Yet these tactical collapses triggered a reorganization of political power across North America. In North America, the threat of recurring invasions by a well-armed, independent militia terrified the isolated British colonies. Realizing they were vulnerable on their own, hesitant provinces united to form a collective unified shield, accelerating the creation of the Dominion of Canada in 1867. Back in Britain, the public execution of 3 Fenians, who became known as the Manchester Martyrs, provoked an outpouring of grief that solidified a cult of militant nationalism within the Irish public. While their invasions failed, and their weapons were eventually scuttled or seized, the Fenians provided the external pressure that forced Canadian unity and radicalized the diaspora for decades. As the original brotherhood faded, its financial and operational networks were absorbed by a successor organization called Clan na Gael. Under the leadership of men like John Devoy, they orchestrated the 1879 New Departure. This strategy fused their underground network with massive public protests over land ownership, linking the quest for political independence with the immediate economic needs of the peasantry. They also established a permanent ideological baseline. They abandoned calls for a monarchy or religious state, demanding instead a secular, democratic republic based on universal male suffrage. By separating their treasury from the battlefield and leveraging diaspora wealth, the Fenians created an organizational engine that could survive decades of suppression. When the Irish Free State was finally established in the 1920s, it recognized this financial lineage by setting up an office in New York to finally redeem those original 1860s bonds.